Sean bienvenidos y bienvenidas al cuarto episodio de la quinta temporada de Datacción, nuestra comunidad digital de práctica e intercambio del conocimiento. Datacción es una producción del Proyecto Regional Infosegura del Programa de las Naciones Unidas para el Desarrollo, que cuenta con el apoyo de la Agencia de los Estados Unidos para el Desarrollo Internacional, USAID. En este capítulo analizaremos la situación de seguridad ciudadana con perspectiva de género en Belice. Para ello contaremos con la participación del señor Ian King, representante residente adjunto de PNUD Belice, la señora Adel Ramos, coordinadora técnica del Observatorio del Crimen de Belice, y la señora Marcela Smoot, coordinadora regional de PNUD Infosegura. Como es costumbre, tendremos un espacio para comentarios y preguntas. Pueden ir dejando sus preguntas en la sección de preguntas y respuestas. Les pido identificarse al hacer la pregunta e indicar a quién o a quiénes va dirigida. También les recuerdo que contamos con el servicio de traducción simultánea, la cual puede ser activada en la barra inferior de Zoom. El fortalecimiento de políticas públicas en seguridad ciudadana basadas en evidencia y el análisis multidimensional para dar soporte a una gobernanza efectiva es indispensable para avanzar en la construcción de sociedades pacíficas, justas e inclusivas y enfrentar los desafíos actuales en la región. En este marco, les cedo la palabra al señor Ian King, representante residente del PNUD en Belice. Adelante.
So good afternoon to everyone. Ms. Marcela Smoot, the project coordinator for Infosegura. Ms. Adel Ramos, technical coordinator for the Belize Crime Observatory. Our, I was going to say Mistress of Seminaries, MC Ms. Tapia. UNDP colleagues, representatives from the governments around Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as the global community, members of our virtual audience. I'm pleased to share remarks at this latest in the Datacción series, having done so in November last year. On that occasion, I noted that Datacción, and I hope I'm not mispronouncing it too badly, was in its third season with over 30 webinars. This was no doubt informed by the COVID crisis, which was firmly into its second year. I recall we were all adapting after the initial hopes that the COVID pandemic and associated restrictions would be over by that time. I shared those remarks while attending the Belize Investment Summit, perhaps the first major in-person event in the country since the start of the crisis, as the world was figuring out how we safely engage in the new reality. We have now transitioned to living in this new context, and certainly have learned to embrace the various forms of communication, not least these webinars. I also recall that Datacción was conceived as a space for creating a community of practice of peers from government, civil society, and academia throughout the region, a mechanism to coordinate practices and their operators to find solutions for citizen security and justice. I think we saw that in the brief video, very well done, and I'm sure Marcela at the end of this webinar will reiterate some of these points. But I do want to take this opportunity to laud my colleagues and the numerous participants for the creation of this community of sharing and learning. Back in November, I also lauded Datacción's efforts and success in realizing gender balance in the process, noting that over 50% of the participants thus far have been female. I also trust that we are recognizing and facilitating the participation of other key populations in our region, such as indigenous populations, Afro-descendants, the youth, and members of the LGBTQ community, to name a few. Today, I'm happy to proceed a presentation by Ms. Adel Ramos, the technical coordinator of the Belize Crime Observatory. Many online will be aware that the USA-funded Evidence-Based Information Management for Citizen Security in Central America and the Dominican Republic project, thankfully shortened to the Infosegura name, has supported Belize since May 2014. Within the first 4 years, UNDP Infosegura provided support to the creation and strengthening and institutionalization of the Police Crime Observatory, or the BCO, and deepening the joint implementation of tools addressing gender, evidence-based policy and decision-making, and the support to a national security strategy. Since the inception of the project, approximately $800,000 US has been invested in Belize in a number of areas, including the establishment and development of technical and institutional capacities, as well as the provision of equipment, both hardware and software, not to mention advocacy and public education. This has facilitated the sharing of data amongst agencies utilizing the integrated information management platform, and the improved analysis as well as the visualization of data and information. I know Ms. Ramos is present in her presentation will provide a clear demonstration of this capacity. However, some of the achievements I would like to reiterate, and I hope she doesn't mind. Beyond the establishment of the BCO, over this period have included advancing development of Belize's cross-cutting crime intelligence architecture, georeferencing of crime data, monthly, quarterly, and annual reports, including major crimes, murder rates, and monthly and annual major crime statistics, support to the third Belize Forensic Science Forum, and also provision of baseline data for the development of the Belize Spotlight Initiative to address gender-based violence. In this, the 40th anniversary of UNDP in Belize, we look forward to continuing support to the nation of Belize and the BCO in enhancing citizen security, including the national structures and widening the engagement and commitment around these issues. While I would not expound now, UNDP is also enabling improved access to services and strengthening livelihoods and supporting digital transformation and e-governance in Belize, as well as further support to access to justice in this country. I should not conclude without, of course, thanking USAID, which has consistently and resolutely supported Infosegura since inception. And through them, we've been able to advance this very good work. Finally, I wish to emphasize the importance of sharing experiences and lessons learned amongst countries, as there's so much to learn from each other. I therefore take great pleasure and a little pride in making way for my colleague, Ms. Ramos. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias, señor King, por sus palabras que reflejan la importancia de contar con espacios como esta comunidad de práctica para promover conocimiento y encontrar soluciones que nos permitan enfrentar los desafíos de seguridad ciudadana en la región. Antes de continuar, les recuerdo que pueden ir dejando sus preguntas en la sección de preguntas y respuestas en la barra inferior de Zoom. A 7 años de la adopción de la Agenda 2030 para el Desarrollo Sostenible, varios países se enfrentan retos para monitorear indicadores de gobernanza, delincuencia, violencia, trata de personas, acceso a la justicia y Estado de Derecho. Desde el PNUD se apoya a los países de la región a fortalecer las capacidades nacionales y a la búsqueda de soluciones integrales que permitan enfrentar sus principales desafíos y construir sociedades más pacíficas y cohesionadas. En este marco, continuamos con la presentación del análisis de seguridad ciudadana en Belice, indicadores clave y otros datos presentados por Adel Ramos. Adelante, Adel.
I'm not sure if Ms. Ramos is speaking, but I can't hear her.
My apologies. How about now?
Yes, now we can hear you.
It's okay, Adele. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Let me say good afternoon once again, and greetings here from Belize. Thank you for the introduction. I am presenting to you now Belize's key citizen security indicators for 2021-2022. And this presentation focuses on major crime summary, the homicides, gender-related violence, property crimes, incarceration, road traffic fatalities, and suicides. In terms of the murder rate, we saw in 2021 where there was an increase relative to the previous year, and so we finished at 29.06. The incarceration rate, however, was down to 335.20. Domestic violence rate in terms of cases lodged by police, those were down also. However, the suicide rate based on autopsies conducted by the National Forensic Science Service, those were up. And I'll talk a little bit more about those later in my presentation. However, the big picture is that overall crimes and offenses were down in 2021. The police focused on 6 categories of major crimes: murder, rape, robbery, burglary, theft. And in the case of theft here, it's for items valued at US $2,500 or more. Unlawful sexual intercourse, that's sexual relations with minors under the age of 16 who cannot legally give consent. There are some other prevalent crimes and offenses, such as common assault, breach of protection orders, assaulting a police officer, sexual assault, aggravated assault, and harm. So with regards to the major crimes for last year, 2021, there was a marginal reduction of 1%. We saw the reduction being in specific categories such as burglary, which usually constitute more than half of the major crimes. So of course, that's a significant statistic there. And when it comes to sexual violence in the major crimes categories, those were both down. But when we look at murders, for example, those were up by 23%, and robbery and theft were also up. Where we are this year, 5 months into 2022, we see where relative to the pre-pandemic period in 2019, everything is still down lower. However, theft is higher. We also notice where, for example, burglaries, even though those are lower than the pre-pandemic period, we've seen where it's edging back up again. And so those are things that, of course, our authorities are focusing on in terms of addressing citizen security in Belize. Normally, we don't report statistics every month on other crime categories, but this is just some information that we're sharing so that you could have an idea of some of the other crimes that are of interest here in Belize. So for example, crimes and offenses, use of threatening words, insulting words, those are verbal types of assaults where we saw use of threatening words increasing. Public drinking decreased. When we look at things like possession of articles with a blade, that was down also. When we look at sexual assault, it was at the same level as the previous year. However, aggravated burglary was up. Obtaining property by deception was up. Attempted murder was also up. So, you have certain categories where you may see a decline, but other categories where you may see an increase. So how do we stand with respect to the region when it comes to homicides? Well, we're not doing too well there. We see, if we look at the Infosegura participating countries, where Belize is really on the higher end at 29.06. And so again, that is something that our authorities have been working at addressing, especially in areas where there are known hotspots. Since 2017, Belize's murder rate has remained higher than the overall homicide rate quoted for Infosegura target countries, as well as the Latin America and Caribbean region. Now, interestingly, we saw where for the years prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, the murder rate was trending downward. And of course, we had that low for 2020 at 24.3, low relative, of course, to what we've been seeing in Belize for the previous years, not relative to our region or, our sister countries in Infosegura. But 2021, we saw where, similar to some of our other sister countries in the region, the rate has been going back up. We have a small population relative to other countries. Also, it's less than 500,000 people living here in Belize. And so even though we might say, well, we reported 125 murders, when you look at it in the context of a very small population, it's still a lot. Belize is divided into 6 districts, and so where we see the highest murder rate is in the Belize district there with 51. The Kaya district is second there at 29.47, and the Stann Creek district is third at 21.12, and these are high also relative to the rates of Infosegura participating countries. The national rate, 29.06, so we see there where 2 districts are lower. Now in the north, the Corozal district being the northernmost district, we see where the rate there is 9.7, and the Orange Walk district 7.38. So those are the lowest national rates at the national level. Historically, we've had fluctuations in the murder count, and this graph basically shows you the difference in terms of the males and females. It's disaggregated by sex, and so you see where the national figure really, that trend is driven by what's happening with respect to our male population. And so a lot of that really is concentrated in certain parts of the country and tends to be gang related, especially when you see spikes. And I'm sure that's not much different from what our other countries in the region have been experiencing. Now, if we look at the box on the right, that's comparing the periods January to May so that you could get a sense of where we are currently. And it's down relative to the same period last year, 2021, by 6%. Now, when we break it down by categories, we see where 111 of the 125 people killed were males and men. 10 were women and 4 were children. So on an average, 10 Belizean lives were lost to murder every month in 2021. We had some months where there were some peaks, and you'll see that later on. But when we zoom into the Belize district, like I mentioned earlier, which had the highest rate at the district level, we can see that in the Belize city area, 4 of 10 murders that happened nationally happened in the Belize city area. And the rate there is 72.64 incidents per 100,000. That was in 2021. Now, although this is relatively high compared to our national rate, in 2018, it was actually 105.64, and so it's actually declined substantially since then. In 2019, the rate declined 31% to 73.11. Of course, there's still much more room for progress. So if you look at the chart on the right, it shows you the line for the rate at the national level, at the district level, and at the Belize city level. And then in the Belize city area, you have 4 policing areas. That's the little box in the center of the slide. And the policing areas, precincts 1 and precincts 2, are where most of those murders actually happen. It's called Southside Belize City. And so we're looking now at the trend line since January 2019, slightly pre-COVID up to the current time. And this shows you essentially how things have transpired over time, particularly during the period of strict mobility restrictions. And what Belize did also during that period of time was to enforce states of emergencies that were targeted at gang or suspected gang members. So actually, even before we had the health-related states of emergencies, we had a gang-related state of emergency. And so that was actually done with the intent of trying to keep those numbers low as much as possible. But you saw where in 2021, we had those spikes. And then after the second spike, where a third gang-related state of emergency was implemented. But this time, what has been different, where you see generally it's been going down. Yes, there are some peaks, but generally staying below those high levels, is because there's been a sustained program targeting not just these suspects or persons who are known to be involved in gang activities using detention or preventative detention, but engaging them in transformative programs. And so the hope is that that would pay its dividends in the not too distant future. When we look at the age group, the big concern here, of course, are males under 30, where 40% of our males under 30 comprised the persons who were killed in 2021, the males who were killed in 2021. And that actually represents an increase of 23% over the previous year. In terms of females, it was the same count, and mostly females who are affected there are 20 to 40. And specifically, we see where 3 in 10 females were ages 35 to 39. Of course, you know that's because of the context of gender-based violence. And so that's what we're going to look at next here. In terms of femicides, Belize doesn't have a legal classification for femicides. And in the past, we've tried not to really do any official classification because of the lack of that legal clarity here in Belize. But in 2021, the cases were so clear-cut that we felt that we could have looked at those cases one by one and make a determination based on, of course, the international norms and classify them as such. And what we saw was that 64% of females who were murdered were victims of gender-related murders or femicides. Interestingly, 7 of these killings were in the context of double murders, and 3 of the women were killed along with their son or daughter, and 1 actually happened to be a police officer who, with her teenage daughter, were murdered in a murder-suicide. It ended up with the alleged perpetrator committing suicide. So proportionally, more females are killed with brute force of blunt and sharp objects than males were during the period. And we saw where during the pandemic period, there was a higher percentage of killings with firearms. When it comes to sexual violence, 96% of reports in 2021 were made by females, and 7 in 10 reports in 2021 were made by females under the age of 16. And this is because of the way that sexual violence in the major crimes category, they're classified. It's rape or unlawful sexual intercourse. So that explains why that ratio is so high there, disproportionately, of course, affecting minors. With regards to domestic violence, 80% of the reports made in 2021 were by females. And we are seeing where right now, relative to the previous period where the cases are increasing, and this doesn't necessarily have to mean that there may be a higher prevalence. It could also mean that given some of the measures that were made by Parliament and some of the efforts on the ground to address domestic violence, that it could be that more people are comfortable or more comfortable in coming forward and making their reports, or agreeing that apart from just making a report, that they are willing to pursue action in court, because we traditionally have a high percentage of those reports not actually being converted into cases that do go to court. So this, of course, could be a signal of something positive happening, really depending on the factors that are resulting now in more reports being converted to actual cases. So that's interesting. Property crimes. Property crimes. Here we're looking at robbery, burglary, and theft. And overall, we're seeing where property crimes, especially burglaries, have remained below pre-pandemic levels, although we're seeing a general increase, especially since November 2021. Noting here that more than half of major crimes reported in Belize are burglaries, and some of these are categorized too as aggravated burglaries or burglaries that are committed with weapons. We saw right after the pandemic where there was a sharp decline. And then after that, there was a sharp rise and then again a decline, fluctuating, and then now trending back up. When it comes to incarceration, the prison population, of course, has declined by about 7% because you no longer have a lot of people entering the system because of not wearing a mask, not being able to pay the fine and that sort of thing. So naturally, that's going to be a smaller figure. But what we also notice in terms of the incarceration, that is also down by a substantial 20%. And largely, the prison population is comprised by adult males, with adult females and minors who are males making up the remaining 9% of those incarcerated. So these are people who enter the prison system either because they are remanded after appearing in court, or in the case of where there were states of emergencies and persons were detained with respect to gang-related charges, persons who enter the system under those circumstances. And so you could understand why there was that sharp decline of 20% for 2021, because you had a relaxation of those measures and of course an easing of the gang-related states of emergencies. Road traffic fatalities, again, with the reopening of the country, of course, people moving about more, you'd expect that there would be more road collisions and fatal road collisions. And here we see where in 2020, road traffic fatalities fell by 44%. However, in 2021, they rose by 61%. And 4 out of every 5 persons who died in fatal road traffic accidents were males. And here, whereas when it comes to the homicides, it's more your younger males, here, you tend to see where more mature persons actually lose their lives in road traffic fatalities. Suicide, similarly, we are seeing where there's also a concerning increase with respect to suicides. We combined data that we received from the Ministry of Health, the epidemiology unit, going as far back as 2009. Actually, we have a year before that, but we didn't include it in here, just to give you that cutoff period of 2009. And we combined it with the autopsies data, which is also shared with the Ministry of Health. And this autopsies data comes from the National Forensic Science Service. So 2020, we saw where there were 44 suicides recorded in the country. And based on the figures from the Ministry of Health and the National Forensic Science Service, this is actually the highest annual count on record that we have. So it's very concerning there, and that represents a 57% increase over 2022. And the data, over 2020. And the data that we're comparing here for those 2 years are both from the National Forensic Science Service. So The median age here for males is 33 and for females 27. And then for the autopsies conducted to mid-June 2022, we see where of those cases, there have been 21 suicides, and we're not halfway into 2022 yet. So we're still seeing that high level. So just some key takeaways here in summary. During 2021, police registered a 1% reduction in major crimes. Urban violence was largely responsible for the increase in Belize's murder rate from 24.33 in 2020 to 29.06 in 2021. Males accounted for 9 in 10 of those victims, and 64% of females who were murdered were victims of femicides, and in some cases, their children were also killed alongside these mothers. 96% of reports of sexual violence in the major crimes category were made by females. Domestic violence cases are on an upward trajectory. Incarceration declined 20% during 2021 based on autopsies conducted during 2020, 2021. Suicides increased 57%, reaching the highest annual count on record since 2009. And road traffic fatalities increased 61%. And both in the case of road traffic fatalities and suicides, we see where 4 in every 5 persons were males. So we'd like to, of course, thank our partners or data sources, the Belize Police Department, Belize Central Prison, National Forensic Science Service, the Statistical Institute of Belize, the Ministry of Health and Wellness Epidemiology Unit for providing the information that we utilize for this presentation. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Adel, por tu análisis siempre puntual, disculpen, de la situación de seguridad ciudadana en Belice, que pone de manifiesto los retos a los que nos enfrentamos en el país. Nos han llegado varias preguntas. Muchísimas gracias a los asistentes por ellas. Empiezo con la primera. ¿Qué factores explican que la tasa de homicidios de Belice sea mayor que en los otros países de la región? La segunda, ¿cuál es el estado de la clasificación o definición legal del feminicidio que actualmente se está ya trabajando en Belice? Te paso la palabra, Adel. Muchísimas gracias.
Hi, thank you. Thank you very much for the questions. So with respect to the murder rate in Belize, like I said, if we look at the historical context, in previous years, it was substantially higher. There was, of course, that period prior to the pandemic where we saw the rate going down, and it continued to go down even up to 2020. And then, of course, we saw that increase last year. So the increase last year is the first increase we've seen in a while. However, given the dynamics that have been happening on the ground in the context of the pandemic and authorities trying to manage the situation with respect to the gangs here in Belize, it's been quite challenging. And of course, you know, I think that there's been some debate as to whether the states of emergencies were truly the best approach to deal with the problem. And I guess you have to be in it to know and to be real about what options are available to you at a given point in time. I mean, hindsight is always 2020, that looking back, you may say, well, maybe we ought to have tried different approaches, but at that point in time, given what the authorities were dealing with on the ground, I can remember right before that first gang-related state of emergency was put into effect, there was multiple homicide and a child was killed, a woman was killed you know, and so that sparked a huge outcry. And the outcry came from the community, and there was a call for action by the authorities. And so to an extent too, they had to do something, you know. And so they had to look at their toolkit to say, all right, what is it that we could do to arrest this? And then also knowing that around us, Belize at the time was not in that state of emergency mode, because we were not one of the first countries to record our first case of COVID. So we didn't have those measures early on, but authorities knew that it was coming. And so what they did, you know, I can remember some of our law enforcement officers looking at it from the perspective that we do not want that when those hospital beds are needed by people who are sick with COVID, that, you know, they're taken up by people who are there as a consequence of gun violence. And so they saw it also as something that they had to do at the time to try to manage the situation, knowing that Belize has very limited medical and health resources, very limited hospital beds. So there were so many things factoring into them applying that approach, and then continuing to apply that approach over that period of time. And then once you pull back, then of course, you know, there are consequences, right? And so I think that played a huge role there, that you cannot sustain states of emergencies forever. And when you do suspend those, then, you know, there's this law that to every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And in terms of dealing with what that equal and opposite reaction is, you know, then you have to try different measures. So it's rather complex. It's rather complex. And when it comes to the femicide legislation, this is something that I've actually raised with the minister responsible for Home Affairs, emphasizing the need, letting him know that also we could look at the cases around us where some other countries in Central America have legislation in place, and that it's time for Belize to seriously start to think along these lines is very important, especially given what we're seeing today. I can remember where we had, you know, years where there were higher counts of femicides. 2020, 2021, we saw 11 each year. There were a few years before that where we saw 19, where I said, you know, this is the highest we've seen since we've been counting these numbers. And so immediately there was a concerted effort again to address the situation, but these efforts have to be sustained, and we have to be real that the time may come again if there isn't firm and decisive action, that we may be seeing those high numbers. And yes, it might not be high relative to other populations, but for Belize it's high because we are a small population. So having that legislation on the books, and especially looking at scenarios where it's not just the mother, it's the mother and whoever else may be in the house. If it's a child, you know, we had a case where it was death by fire, not by gunshot. I mean, we really have to seriously think that, yes, it's 11 now, but if we don't act now, it may get a lot worse. So advocacy, you know, we continue to advocate for those changes. Thank you for your question.
Muchísimas gracias, Adel. Hemos tenido muy buena recepción del análisis de Belice. Continuamos con más preguntas. ¿Existen políticas o iniciativas en particular implementadas para abordar la violencia sexual contra las niñas en Belice? También tenemos alguna evidencia, algún análisis que relacione el uso de drogas por parte de mujeres y los feminicidios. ¿Podemos continuar con estas dos preguntas, Adel, por favor?
Okay, I think there are several layers of things there in terms of the question that has been posed. I'll ask you to kindly repeat. Yes, can you kindly repeat the question?
Claro. Claro. ¿Existen políticas o iniciativas en particular implementadas para abordar la violencia sexual contra las niñas? Esa es la primera pregunta. La siguiente, si existe un análisis, evidencia que establezca la relación entre el uso de drogas por parte de las mujeres y los feminicidios.
I'll take the second one first and the first one second. So with respect to the use of drugs by women, this is a very interesting question, but the scenarios that we have seen in the recent past, we have not had any evidence of drug use by the women being the problem. I'm not saying that there's no case where that is an issue, but in terms of drug use by women, if it's the women who are the victims here, even if the women may have
Adele,
a challenge
this
with,
is Ian. I think the question was more along the lines, is there evidence that drug use, purportedly by the men, I guess, or the men perpetrators of violence, is contributing to the violence against women? I think that's the nature of the question.
Okay. All right. Well, I guess that's a different matter. I would have to say that this would have to be analyzed. Drug, alcohol use, yes, is one of the more prevalent factors in domestic violence in general. And this would have to be looked at, of course, on a case-to-case basis, but there is indication based on the data on domestic violence that drug and alcohol use is a problem in many of these scenarios. And so you would expect that it would also then be a factor with respect to the femicides. But to have that empirical evidence, it would have to be studied some more. Like I said, we haven't been doing official classifications, right? And so this, I think, would have to be a part of the larger framework of the analysis of these cases. With respect to the policies and initiatives to address sexual violence, particularly against girls, I believe the question was focused on sexual violence against girls. There have been legislative reforms happening over a period of years here in Belize to make special provisions, especially since earlier forms of legislation did not specifically address certain categories, and a lot has been fleshed out in terms of Belize's legislative framework, which then empowers the judiciary to be able to address those cases more specifically. We also have the Belize Sex Offenders Registry Initiative that's been ongoing and supported by Infosegura. That also is something that is ongoing, and that helps us also to address the matter of sexual violence against women and girls. Of course, all victims, all survivors of sexual violence. And so the government of Belize has been addressing this for quite some time now, particularly with respect to legislative reforms, and then also with other initiatives to enhance surveillance. I can't tell you in terms of the conviction rate for these sexual offenses, because one of the gaps that we have right now is to be able to get some solid statistics on conviction rates. But we do know that oftentimes these cases, as long as they do end up in court, that the judiciary makes a very keen effort to administer justice as best as possible. Sometimes the challenge is, of course, the nature of the case, the sensitivity, you know, getting the evidence to get that conviction and to ensure that the persons who suffer sexual violence are not re-victimized when these cases are tried. And so there's also been a lot of effort there to protect victims of sexual violence from that sort of re-victimization, even in terms of court proceedings, including, you know, making provisions for using information and communications technology to protect the persons who may need to provide evidence in court and that sort of thing. And so that has helped to complement the legislative changes that have happened over time, right? To have that environment in the courtroom, or even if it is through, you know, virtual connections, to promote the delivery of justice when it comes to sexual violence, and especially where minors are concerned.
If colleagues don't mind, I'd also like to share on this point, because the UN as a whole, many three responsible UN organizations, UNDP, UNICEF, and UNFPA, along with the UN Resident Coordinator's Office, has, let me turn my video on so you can see me when I speak, but has been implementing the Global Spotlight Initiative project, and the whole purpose of that is to address gender-based violence. And in this regard, there have been a lot of work in terms of advocacy, in terms of capacity building of this, including CSOs that are working with women, in terms of addressing things like the National Gender-Based Policy and Action Plan, looking at legislation, looking at the judicial system. So a comprehensive approach to how you address the whole issue of gender-based violence, recognizing it's systemic. I mean, some of the initiatives, including working with men and boys through different CSOs and so on. So the whole approach to gender-based violence is really one of comprehensive. This complements what has been happening otherwise as well. The main lead in this respect, the Ministry of Human Development, is the lead for Spotlight in terms of the government entity. And so coming back to the question raised about drugs and if that contributes, I think there are a number of issues. For example, a poll showed that there's still a relatively high percentage of men, and so surprisingly women, still believe it is acceptable for women to be beaten by their partners. Fortunately a minority, but still a relatively high number. And so in terms of looking at the structures that are there to support women who are, you know, suffer from gender-based violence, in terms of building capacity, including with the first responders and the police and so on, and how they can seek redress in court. So there are a number of multifaceted approaches to addressing this issue. So I thought I would just add to that, and I'm sure I've spoken too long. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias a ambos por profundizar en las preguntas que nos hacen nuestros asistentes. Tenemos una pregunta más relacionada con los momentos en el año en que ocurren ciertos homicidios. Lo marcaba de él en alguna de las diapositivas que nos mostró. ¿Tienen alguna explicación de por qué se llevan a cabo estos homicidios en determinados meses?
Hi. Why homicides happen in certain months of the year? Well, we've seen where essentially COVID and the dynamics there have really changed a lot, right? So for example, it used to be said, yes, that some particular months you could expect that you would have an uptick in the murders, in the homicides. And so that, of course, is something that our law enforcement authorities would consider in terms of deciding what strategies they would use to try to preempt those scenarios. But we saw something different happening over the past few years, where it's not a situation where you could kind of figure, okay, since it's usually around this time, we could expect it. Because remember, there were these dynamics with the states of emergencies that really changed things on the ground, right? And so what we're looking at right now is not a usual pattern. It's really different. And a number of factors contribute to that. And also considering the mitigation measures that are being implemented. For example, the Ministry of Home Affairs and New Growth Industries did something called a wilderness camp, right? And in that wilderness camp, they targeted specific persons who they felt that if they were not engaged in that sort of activity, may have been involved in other types, or may have been drawn into other types of activities that may have then fed into violent crimes and possibly murders, particularly in the Belize city area. And so you have multiple things going on that essentially are changing the dynamics as we speak. We still do have some scenarios where, let's say, if in the hotspots where you have gang-related murders, where a key figure is murdered, right? Then, of course, it would be anticipated that absent some sort of intervention, that there would be retaliation, right? And that could lead to further acts of violence in the streets. And so the current administration established what is called a leadership intervention unit. And that's a part of their role, is to look at those types of scenarios and to take proactive measures, knowing that certain scenarios would result in those types of retaliations. Also, looking at where you may have gang operatives or groups shifting their activities from one part of the country to another part of the country. And so where you may find that there may be a spike in a particular area in a particular month, and that may be the normal pattern, right? Depending on the response of law enforcement and how the persons who are engaged in those activities may respond to that, they may cool off for a while, or they may decide to shift to another part of the country, right? And they may not be getting involved in maybe those specific kinds of crimes, but they may shift to getting involved in property crimes, So the dynamics, they're really complex, and that is why it's important then for there to be that engagement that I think the leadership intervention unit is doing, knowing the persons who would even be open to being engaged in, certain types of programs that would get them out of, those pathways and help them to steer their life in a different direction. So I think that this multi-pronged approach that is being implemented is a good one, and that if it's done consistently over time, I really do think that there would be some positive results. But at the same time, organized crime continues to pose a threat to Belize, as it does to the whole region. And yes, you might, excuse me, you might tackle those sorts of frontiers in the cities, but if organized crime is not seriously tackled, then again, it will continue to feed into this vicious cycle, and it will be a new cohort, and it will be another cohort down the road. And so you cannot divorce them. And also, I think that that is an area where I think there needs to be even more concerted effort to address, because we know the realities that happen over time, where these gains can be easily lost if you only focus on one area, but you're not dealing with the other areas of organized crime. So thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Adel, por tus respuestas. Muchísimas gracias. Estamos ya sobre el tiempo. Podemos concluir con las palabras ya de la coordinadora regional del proyecto, Marcela Smut.
Muy buenas tardes a todas y a todos los que nos acompañan el día de hoy. En esta sesión de la Datacción. Es un gusto poder compartir y escuchar la experiencia de Belice, el análisis de situación. Quiero agradecer de manera especial a mis colegas, el señor Ian King y a la señora Del Ramos, por las excelentes presentaciones. Ian nos recordaba el trabajo que se viene desarrollando conjuntamente o bajo el liderazgo en realidad de las instituciones nacionales en Belice para continuar avanzando en el entendimiento de la problemática de la inseguridad y de los factores asociados, el trabajo que se ha ido desarrollando de fortalecimiento de capacidades, de equipamiento, los análisis que hemos venido desarrollando, y Adel nos compartía esta excelente presentación sobre los distintos temas de incidencia delictiva. Realmente ha ido avanzando Belice en estos análisis y nos traía Adel estas reflexiones sobre los cambios de dinámica a raíz del COVID y elementos que tenemos que ir entendiendo mejor. Nos mencionaba también, a través del análisis podíamos ver cómo han ido enfatizando en poder entender la heterogeneidad de la dinámica de la violencia y la inseguridad, cómo se expresa de manera diferenciada, cómo en algunos territorios es más marcada la forma de violencia, el análisis de violencia contra las mujeres y las niñas que nos presentaban también. Algo de Belice que queremos resaltar es la actualización permanente que están haciendo de la incidencia delictiva, de los factores asociados. En un tiempo muy rápido, Belice ha presentado este año este análisis de situación y un esfuerzo muy importante de difundir los informes, también resaltar el trabajo del Observatorio del Crimen por integrar información de diferentes fuentes y por tratar de entender las dinámicas que están debajo de esta incidencia delictiva de las diferentes formas de violencia. Quiero resaltar también dentro de la presentación que nos compartía Adel, la frase "una vida cuenta", y el esfuerzo importante que Belice está haciendo en seguir trabajando en la recolección de información, en compartir esta información entre diferentes fuentes para poder analizar la problemática, y creo que es el camino realmente para fortalecer las políticas públicas sobre la base de evidencia y poder utilizar los recursos que se tengan para lograr respuestas más efectivas a esta problemática de la violencia, sin la cual no podemos avanzar hacia sociedades más justas, pacíficas e inclusivas, tal como nos propone la Agenda de Desarrollo Sostenible. Quiero agradecerles muchísimo por compartirnos estos análisis. Estamos aprendiendo mucho de la experiencia de Belice. Realmente ha generado muchas preguntas, intereses, y les agradecemos nuevamente por compartirnos hoy esta experiencia, y esperamos continuar en estas sesiones escuchando los diferentes países y aprendiendo unos de otros en el marco de esta comunidad de práctica virtual que es la Datacción. Nos quedaríamos acá el día de hoy y los esperamos nuevamente dentro de 15 días para continuar con estos análisis sobre las distintas formas de violencia, las dinámicas, los factores que nos ayudan a entender y también empezar a pensar a partir de soluciones o de respuestas que se han planteado, que se plantean desde los diferentes países, que nos ayuden a pensar cómo trabajar y cómo ir buscando formas efectivas para avanzar hacia sociedades más integradas, cohesionadas, pacíficas y desarrolladas. Muchísimas gracias a todas y a todas por acompañarnos el día de hoy y nos vemos en 15 días entonces en esta Datacción.